Hi, my name is Paddy Nixon and we're here to have a conversation with Michelle Grattan on This Week in Politics. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Paddy.
3 weeks into the lockdown in Melbourne and we still haven't flattened the curve. If anything, it seems to be getting worse. Outbreaks now in Sydney and Queensland. And then it seems to be exasperating the issues in aged care with mass outbreaks. This really is a significant issue. Now, with the federal government, they obviously have responsibility for aged care, but the states have responsibility for delivering healthcare. Where's the issues lie? Is there something fundamentally going wrong here?
Well, I think that the issues are both the immediate challenges of the pandemic, but also the underlying weaknesses of the aged care system. Now, the immediate challenge, of course, is that a lot of workers in this system are not well paid, are casual, are working between jobs, and they have brought the virus into the aged care homes. It's not the visitors, it's not the families, it's the workers, and of course if they're in multiple places then that just makes things worse. Some of these problems are being addressed on the fly, but that goes to the fundamental problem, which is that this system is really not fit for purpose. Now, we've had a Royal Commission which is ongoing, but it's given an interim report late last year and it was scathing about the weaknesses of the system. And of course, in a time of extreme pressure, those weaknesses have just caught up with things and have made this situation worse. And I think also the other lesson out of this is that after the problems in a couple of high-profile nursing homes in Sydney, the government really needed to do a lot more to buttress the system, and it didn't do that fast enough or adequately enough. For example, the protective equipment, there have been gaps in that and staff have not used it properly.
And so really what we're seeing is the coronavirus is a significant pressure on the system, but it's actually those long-term systemic problems that are just being highlighted by it.
Well, that's right. If the system had been stronger, if the preparations had been better, you could have, I think, at least minimised this problem. But what's happened is that the weaknesses in the whole system have exacerbated the whole thing.
And then moving on to matters across the country, obviously the Morrison government has been putting some pressure on Western Australia to open their borders, even supporting Clive Palmer in his legal case, not aligning and certainly distancing themselves from him politically. Really, and how do Western Australians feel about this being closed off from the rest of Australia?
Well, I think that in terms of public opinion, the Western Australians are pretty happy with the border closure, and for that matter, the Queenslanders are pretty happy with their government taking a strong line on the border. Queensland was reluctant to open and now, of course, has reclosed to people from Greater Sydney. But you've got the Prime Minister wanting to get as much economic activity going as quickly as possible, but you've got the general public in these smaller states saying, well, we've got very few cases, in some cases no active cases at all, and we don't want to have it coming in from elsewhere. So when the government is attacking, the federal government is attacking the Western Australian government during this big Victorian outbreak, I don't think that line will be resonating much on the ground around Perth.
And of course also the Premier in Queensland, Anastasia Palaszczuk, she very suddenly closed the border to Sydney-siders. Do you think she overreacted?
It's hard to know if the few cases that there are in Queensland don't multiply quickly. There'll be an argument that she has, but I think that in general, the public do want their leaders to take a cautious position. Scott Morrison always talks about the twin crises on the health front, on the economic front. But in the court of public opinion, I think that the health crisis is taking priority, and people say, well, if it's a choice, fix the health things or take the most cautious line on health.
And we discussed the budget last week, and obviously the changing world of the pandemic in Victoria and the lockdowns. Is that going to have changed how that budget's looking?
Well, indeed, it already has, Paddy. We had some evidence from the head of the Treasury, Stephen Kennedy, this week to the Senate committee that looks at the government's response to COVID. And he said that even since the figures that Treasury had given for that budget update last week, things had deteriorated in Victoria, and clearly the Treasury is expecting further deterioration. So those figures are already out of date, will become more out of date. And he also made the point that the Victorian situation affects confidence more widely in the country. So it changes people's behaviour, and it's a dampener on economic activity. So Josh Frydenberg will be having to do even more work than he was expecting to only last week.
Yesterday, the Morrison government presented a new agreement for closing the gap to improve Indigenous health standards and standards of living. How does this one differ from the old one?
Firstly, it has a lot more targets, and quite interestingly, some of those targets go to wider cultural issues, for example, promoting Aboriginal languages and also the attachment of Indigenous people to the land. So much broader. I think that the real difference, though, is that this agreement has been negotiated with a coalition of Aboriginal people, representatives of Aboriginal communities. So there's more buy-in by Indigenous leaders to trying to make progress. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, automatically that progress will be made, because so many of these problems in the communities are really endemic, very, very hard to deal with. But at least I think that the agreement is being more ambitious. Another area of particular interest is trying to reduce incarceration, because this is really a big problem which has only got worse, I think, in recent years, rather than making any significant progress. Already, it must be admitted, the agreement has come under some criticism from Aboriginal leaders who weren't at the centre of it, and of course it doesn't go to the voice to Parliament, which is a big issue in the Indigenous community, and we're not making any progress on recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution. However, leaving the criticisms aside, leaving the limitations aside, and being realistic, I think that we can say that it is a step forward, and we can just hope that the step that's been made is the beginning of a longer and more successful journey to improve conditions in these communities.
So thank you very much, Michelle, for another fascinating conversation about this week in politics.
Thanks, Paddy.